Hello. So this video is intended to serve as an introduction to making and evaluating philosophical arguments. This is the sort of thing that would typically be covered at the beginning of an intro to philosophy class. So if you've already studied a bit of philosophy, then this may seem a bit basic, but nevertheless, I figured that it would be helpful to sort of lay this out before getting into some of the more particular arguments that we'll be discussing on this channel. So to start, we might lay out the general question of what is an argument as we're understanding it here. So in philosophy, an argument is typically understood to be a set of claims or statements where one of these claims, known as the conclusion, is intended to be proven or at least supported by the others, which are known as premises. So for example, consider the following argument. Claim 1, all birds are warm-blooded. Claim 2, the scarlet macaw is a bird. Therefore, from 1 and 2, the scarlet macaw is warm-blooded. So in this argument, premises 1 and 2, that is the first two claims, which are the premises, are intended to prove claim 3, which is the conclusion. So there's an important note to make on how we're understanding arguments here. So that is, the same conclusion can be supported by many different arguments. The point of any specific argument is to show that a specific conclusion follows from the premises given in that argument. But even if that argument does not work, this does not mean that the conclusion must be false. It might not even mean that we have evidence that the conclusion is false. What we should keep in mind then is that we should not judge arguments based on whether or not we think that there is some good reason to accept the conclusion. Rather, we should judge arguments based on whether the premises provided in that particular argument provide us with good reason to accept the conclusion. So one important concept to bring in when talking about arguments is that of validity. An argument is valid when and only when its conclusion must follow from its premises. In other words, it is valid when it is impossible for all of the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. So note, validity describes the relation that holds between the premises and the conclusion. An argument is valid if the truth of the premises would be enough to guarantee the truth of the conclusion, if it turns out that the premises are true. For the sake of validity, it does not matter whether the premises are actually true. What matters is just whether this relation holds, that is, namely, whether if the premises were all true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. But since validity does not depend on the actual truth of the conclusion or the premises, we have another notion that we bring in here known as soundness. So an argument is sound when it is valid and has all true premises. So note, unlike validity then, soundness is not merely about the relation between the premises and the conclusion. Soundness does depend on this relation, since a sound argument must be a valid one, but the question of whether an argument is sound also depends on the actual status of the premises, that is, on whether or not they are actually true. So to see and hopefully make these notions of validity and soundness a bit more clear, let's walk through a few examples. So to start, let's go back to the argument I gave at the very beginning as just a general example of an argument. So argument number 1, premise 1, all birds are warm-blooded. Premise 2, the scarlet macaw is a bird. Conclusion, therefore, from 1 and 2, the scarlet macaw is warm-blooded. This argument is both valid and sound because its premises are true and its conclusion follows from its premises. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. So let's look at another argument now. Argument number 2. Premise 1, all bananas are fish. Premise 2, all fish are mammals. Therefore, from 1 and 2, all bananas are mammals. Now you might notice that presumably neither premise 1 nor premise 2 are true here, and so the argument is not sound. However, it is valid, and this is because it has the right relation between the premises and the conclusion. Namely, the premises are such that if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. The premises here could not be true without the conclusion also being true, so the argument's valid. But since the premises are not in fact true, they're actually false, the argument comes out to be unsound. So let's look at a few other examples. Okay, argument number 3. Premise 1, cats are mammals. Premise 2, dogs are mammals. Conclusion, therefore, from 1 and 2, raccoons are mammals. Now, this argument is neither valid nor sound. It's invalid and unsound. And this is because even though the premises are both true, it's not valid and hence unsound. And the reason that it's not valid is that it does not have the right relationship between the premises and the conclusion. The conclusion provides a claim about raccoons, but the premises have not given us any information about raccoons, so they're not enough to justify the truth of this conclusion. In other words, we might say it is possible that these premises could all be true without the conclusion being true. It doesn't necessarily follow from them, and so it's invalid. Okay, let's look at another example. Argument number 4. Premise 1, if Miami is in Florida, then Miami is in the United States. Premise 2, Miami is in Florida. Therefore, from 1 and 2, Miami is in the United States. This argument is valid and sound. It has the right relationship. If both of the premises are true, then the conclusion would have to be true as well. And both premises are in fact true, so it is sound as well. Okay, a couple more examples. So argument number 5. Premise 1, if it is John's birthday, then John will take the day off from work. Premise 2, it is not John's birthday. Therefore, from 1 and 2, John will not take the day off work. So this one actually might appear somewhat tricky upon first glance, but this is actually an invalid and unsound argument. And the reason for this is that it doesn't have the right relation in order to be valid. And the reason for that is that, well, if we look at premise 1, we can see that premise 1 gives us a rule. It says that if it's John's birthday, then John will take the day off from work. And so what we know from that rule is that if it is John's birthday, we can also get the truth of the claim that he will take the day off from work. But that rule doesn't tell us anything about what will happen if it's not John's birthday. It could, for example, be the case that even if it's not his birthday, he would take the day off for other reasons. Maybe he's sick, for example. So simply knowing that the first part of the rule given in premise 1 is not true doesn't tell us that the second part is not true for some other reason. And so the argument does not have the right relation to get us the conclusion. That is, again, he could take the day off for many other reasons. So let's look at one more example here. Argument number 6. If it will be sunny, then Jane will go to the park. Jane will go to the park. Therefore, from 1 and 2, it will be sunny. So this one, again, might appear a bit tricky, but it's also invalid and unsound. And even though the claim being made by premise 2 connects to premise 1 a bit differently than in example or argument number 5, something similar is going on here where we're not making the right claim to connect to premise 1 in order for us to get the conclusion that we're trying to get. So what's going on here in particular is, again, that premise 1 gives us a rule that says if one thing's the case, this other thing will be the case. Here, it says that if it will be sunny, then Jane will go to the park. So we know that if it will be sunny, it has to also be true that Jane will go to the park. But as we saw with argument 5, knowing that it's not sunny, or knowing that it's not John's birthday, does not tell us whether or not Jane will go to the park or whether or not John will take the day off from work, respectively. These could be the case for other reasons. But we also know that since these could be the case for other reasons, the fact that Jane will go to the park does not tell us that it will be sunny. That is, knowing that the second part of the rule here is true, which is what premise 2 tells us, we don't know that the first part is true. That is, even if we know that Jane will go to the park, we do not know that it will be sunny. We might know that it being sunny is a reason that Jane would go to the park, but there could be many other reasons as well. So the mere fact that she will go to the park does not tell us that it is sunny, even combined with the rule given in premise 1. So this doesn't have the right relation to show us that we can derive the conclusion that it will in fact be sunny. So again, the relation here is not enough for validity. The argument's invalid and hence unsound for that reason. And a general note on both of these arguments here is that you might say, well, how are we supposed to evaluate the soundness given that we don't know who John and Jane are? Presumably, we can't really determine whether or not the premises here are true. But recall that soundness requires validity. So since these arguments are invalid, they're automatically unsound, whether they have true premises or not. Okay. So now that we've seen some examples, another thing I want to go over here is that there are popularly considered to be three types of arguments. So first we have deductive arguments, which attempt to show that the conclusion must be true. And we can contrast this with inductive and abductive arguments. So first, inductive arguments attempt to show that the conclusion is probable, whereas abductive arguments attempt to show that we should accept the conclusion because it is the best explanation for something. So to make this distinction a bit clearer, we'll walk through each of these types of arguments in a bit more detail. So let's start with deductive arguments. So the argument examples that we have looked at so far have been deductive arguments, but as we saw, some have been bad ones. And it will likely remain true that the majority of arguments that we see in philosophy are deductive. Not all, but most. So validity and soundness, it should be noted, only apply to deductive arguments. And this is because it is only in the case of deductive arguments that we can say that we have a conclusion that must be true. And this is what we have said is the case when we have a sound argument. So note here, an argument can be deductive even if it fails to be valid and or sound, since an argument counts as deductive based on the type of support that it attempts to provide for its conclusion. So it could be invalid and hence unsound by being a bad deductive argument, but so long as it's set up to show, in an attempt to show that the conclusion must follow from the premises, it would count as a deductive argument. So inductive arguments attempt to do something different. We haven't yet looked at an example of one, but here, I'll provide one now. So premise one, the sun has risen today, yesterday, the day before that, and so on. Premise two, if the sun has risen today, yesterday, the day before that, and so on, the sun will probably rise again tomorrow. Therefore, from 1 and 2, the sun will probably rise again tomorrow. And this is, of course, a rather simple example, but many inductive arguments take this general sort of form of arguing that something is probable based on past observations and perceived regularities. Related to this, whereas many areas of philosophy and mathematics rely primarily on deductive arguments, many areas of observational science rely more on inductive arguments. So lastly, we have abductive arguments. We haven't looked at an example of one of these either, but here's one. Premise one, there is a table sitting in the room. Premise two, if there is a table sitting in the room, then the best explanation of this fact is that a human being put the table here. Conclusion, therefore, from 1 and 2, a human being put the table here. So abductive arguments are sometimes used in both philosophy and the sciences, though they tend to be a bit less common than the other two types of arguments. So there we go. We've seen some basics about arguments. We've seen three types of arguments, and we've also seen the notions of validity and soundness insofar as they apply to deductive arguments. So those are the main concepts and ideas that I want to illustrate here. That's all I have for this video, but I hope this has been helpful. Thanks.